Welcome back to the Side Chat Podcast. This week we are going to discuss a handful of Douglas aircraft planes. They were probably the powerhouse for the U.S. aircraft manufacturer, and they didn't have very many, you could say, sexy fighters, but they made a lot of backbone aircraft. And Cobey's going to do quite a bit of talking in this because he knows, I'd probably say more about the subject than I ever will. So you want to real quickly talk about the founders and the creators of Douglas aircraft?
Yeah, Douglas was started by a guy named Donald Douglas, hence the name Douglas. The guy was a flippin' genius. He basically responsible for modern commercial air travel due to the DC-1 and DC-2 designs, and later the DC-3 design that he made. He also employed a guy by the name of Jack Northrop. Perhaps you've heard of Northrop. They made the P-61 Black Widow. They made a bunch of other airplanes as well. Jack got started with Douglas. He was Douglas's chief designer for a long time. Then finally got pissed off and struck out on his own. The guy that replaced him was Northrop's assistant, the guy by the name of Ed Heinemann, which in my personal opinion is probably the greatest airplane designer ever. The guy was an absolute genius. He created pretty much every airplane we're going to talk about and worked all the way up into the 70s. His last design that he worked on was the F-16. Remember that name, Ed Heinemann.
So the first aircraft that we're going to talk about, and this is the hard part, is if you look up Douglas Aircraft's work history, there's almost 100-something airplanes between prototypes and commercial and military and so on, and it's impossible for us to do a podcast where we talk about all of this. They made an insane amount of aircraft, so I picked about a handful that either will be in War Thunder, should be in War Thunder, or are in War Thunder. And we're going to start out with one that I'm kind of surprised has never entered the War Thunder tech tree yet, which is kind of one of those things, like, any patch, you should add this plane because it's kind of important for early U.S. tech tree, which is the Devastator. And I've been harsh on the Devastator in past podcasts because in World War II it was completely obsolete. But when it entered service in the mid-30s, this was probably the most advanced aircraft on the world, maybe for a few minutes. Like, aircraft design was moving so quickly at this point. But when it hit, it was the U.S. Navy's first all-metal aircraft. It was the first monoplane, I think, torpedo bomber that at least we had. And etc. It was just completely outclassed by the time World War II rolled around. And it had a crew of 3, I'll mention that. The problem with it is, part of the problem was the aircraft being underpowered, underarmored, etc. The other problem was the torpedoes that we used for it had to be dropped at like 115 miles an hour or some ridiculously slow speed, which made it easy killings. I mean, the Zeros loved that. And the Devastator will always be remembered for its failure at Midway. And you want to talk a bit about that, or shall I?
Yeah, I wouldn't really say it's a failure. I mean, ultimately, Midway was a great victory for the U.S., but problem with the Devastator and Midway was the torpedo. Well, two things. Well, more than the torpedo.
There's many issues.
First thing, they were launched at the absolute extreme end of their range. They wanted to get closer than what Admiral Spruance wanted the carriers to be at. So the Devastators were launched at the extreme edge of their range. Because of that, they had a lot of gas on board. Because of that, they were really heavy, so they took off really slow. The airplane didn't climb very well. It was a pretty advanced airplane in 1937 when it hit the squadrons, powered by one of the most powerful engines available back then. The problem is that technology develops in such a rapid pace at that time, between like 36 and 40, that it was just outclassed by everything else by the time we got there. Remember, we were totally surprised by the Zero. We had no idea what the Zero was like until Pearl Harbor. No idea whatsoever. The Zero just shredded the torpedo bombers, absolutely shredded them. Part of the problem with that is because of the torpedo. The torpedo that we had at the time was a really shitty torpedo. It could only be launched at like 115, 120 miles an hour, and I think you can only be like 60 or 70 feet off the deck for it to launch, for it to be successful. A very slow torpedo too, and actually the reason why the torpedo bombers didn't get very many hits is because the Japanese knew about this and had trained to maneuver away from the torpedo. So they could very easily even turn their big carriers in enough time to maneuver away from the very, very, very slow torpedo that we had. The reason why I say that the Devastator was pretty successful is it did one thing. It dragged all the fighters, all the Zeros, down to sea level. The Devastators had Wildcats for fighter cover above them. The problem is that the wrong fighter squadron was covering the wrong torpedo squadron at the time, and they didn't have the right frequency to talk to each other. So the torpedo guys were calling on the radio for fighter cover, and the fighters never heard them. So they just stayed above orbiting, not seeing a damn thing what happened down below. But with all the Zeros on the deck, that cleared the sky for all the Dauntlesses to come in and dive bomb and sink all the carriers. The Devastators did sink, I think, 2 ships. They sunk a cruiser and they sunk a destroyer. That's really it. There were 3 torpedo squadrons involved: VT-8 off the Hornet, VT-6 off the Enterprise, VT-3 off the Yorktown. VT-8, all of the airplanes got shot down except one. The one airplane that wasn't, well, I guess it was really shot down. Only one guy survived. His name was George Gay. He was an ensign George Gay. He was the last airplane to launch off the Hornet from VT-8. He's the only VT-8 Devastator that actually made it close enough to launch his torpedo. His torpedo missed. As soon as he let his torpedo go, he was shot down by a Zero. His gunner and his radio operator, his bombardier, died instantly. He survived. He survived by hanging on to a piece of floating debris and was basically smack dab in the middle of the carriers. He floated there for a while and was eventually picked up.
He watched
everyone else.
But there wasn't the famous thing about him is he actually watched the carriers explode.
He did, yep, yeah. He floated right by. They were passing him. He was just floating there with the rest of the junk, and no one saw him. Luckily, or else he would have been probably a POW. Yeah, he was the only guy from Torpedo 8 to survive, the Devastators at least. BT-8 at the time was the very first Navy squadron to transition to the TBF Avenger. So only half the squadron was on the Hornet. The other half was still back in Norfolk in training. They did have 5 Avengers on Midway, and of those, only 4 of them made it back.
And that program was almost canceled because...
only one of them made it back. The other 4
and that program almost was canceled because of that performance.
Because that's exactly correct, yep. Devastator was a great airplane. It was just too little too late. It was really outclassed. It wasn't very heavily armored. It only had 130 cal machine gun in the back for the rear gunner. The commander of VT-8, I think his name was Hutch, I think is what his name was. He watched the Dauntless squadrons off the Enterprise, off of Bombing 6, VB6. He watched them modify the airplanes with twin 30s and ordered his squadron to do the same thing. So he actually scrounged up some extra 1919 machine guns and some armor and had his Dauntless squadron armorers make up kits for their Devastators. So VT-8 was the only squadron that had 2 machine guns in the back. The other 2, VT-3 and VT-6, only had 1 unarmored 30 cal machine gun for protection. That's it.
So real quick, I want to say this because when I did the Midway podcast, I might have got some information wrong. And I've looked at the Wikipedia. I've looked at 6 or 7 United States history sites. I've looked at 2 books of mine. And I'm going to go with Cobey's book here, because every freaking website or book has a different number listed on the number of Devastators that launched and the number that came back. And it's very kind of bizarre. So I guess with our official number, it's going to be 41 went out, and then, was it 6 actually made it back?
41 went out, 14 from VT-8, 15 from VT-6, 12 from VT-3. 6 made it back. The 6th one ran out of gas while landing and ditched next to the Enterprise.
I just find it funny how all these historians or bloggers or whoever else are writing, all these articles can't get this information correct. It's kind of...
Well, part of the problem is that it was such a mess because the Yorktown was basically sunk by then. It was damaged extensively, so no one could land on the Yorktown. So the airplanes the Devastators that did make it back, a lot of them went for the Yorktown because the Yorktown was the closest carrier. But the problem is that the Enterprise people counted their airplanes that they saw coming over from the Yorktown as survivors. So it probably wasn't 6. I mean, that's the problem. We don't know exactly who came back.
Okay.
Because the records are shit.
All right, fair enough. I've seen so many, inconsistencies with just that number that I can't come up with a number that I say is correct because I wasn't there.
It's pretty terrible.
So, the other plane we're going to talk about, the other important plane, this is probably I'll call it the star of the Pacific fleet, was the Dauntless. The Dauntless did so
Early
much
in the war,
damage.
yes.
So much
it did. It was
damage.
a great airplane.
Like we talked about, it's always going to be known for its operations in Midway because, essentially, long story short, Cobey kind of told everything. The Zeros basically landed. A lot of the Japanese bombers landed. A lot of their stuff was either drawn back for fuel and ammo, or it was all dragged low to begin with. And the Dauntless squadrons were lost. They didn't know where the fleet was. There was cloud cover and so on. And they took their, I guess you could say, sweet time. But they were lucky enough to spot it when they were running out of fuel. But they were at the end of their range. And they killed 4 aircraft carriers that day at Midway. And so it'll always be known as the plane that changed the tide for the U.S. Navy in the Pacific War. It was at Operation Torch, covering the Allied invasion there. And then the other important stat is that it killed the most Japanese shipping of any U.S. aircraft. So even after Midway, this thing went on to have a long storied history, different battles and so on. It did have some issues, even though you always hear the great tales of what the Dauntless did. It had pretty short range for what it is. It was hard to fly. I've always read about how much the plane rattled, how much you had to constantly feather the throttle, how much you had to apply rudder. I don't know if the aircraft wasn't well built or well designed, but the pilots loved the thing, but it was just you had to consistently pay attention to what it was doing when you had to fly it. But as somebody said once on the channel, I forgot what, somebody made a comment, it's kind of funny, that the dive bomber was basically the first guided munitions on this planet. That Dauntless had, I don't know how you could say it, had extreme accuracy. I mean, all dive bombers do, but the Dauntless had extreme accuracy when it went ship bombing. And then you're going to hear quite a few tales of it with the dual 30s. We'll talk about that real quick. You want to talk about what they did for the dual 30s? That dual 30 armament actually did quite a bit of damage to the early Zeros.
The rear or the front?
The rear.
The rear is basically, the Dauntless originally came out just like the Devastator with one M1919 machine gun as cover. Someone from VB6, which is the Enterprise's bombing squadron, got the great idea to take basically 2 and bolt them together with a piece of armor for the radio operator / gunner in the back. They didn't tell anyone about it, and the Japanese didn't know about it until they pulled up on the back of a Dauntless and got the shit shot out of them by 2 guns instead of 1. After that, it actually became standard. The factory started making it after that.
But the original armor, it might be the one in game. I'm not sure what the in-game armor looks like. That was just made from scrap metal, right, on the ships?
Yep, that's correct. Yep. It was just made from scrap metal that they found.
And that's about all I want to say about the Dauntless. Like I said, I've talked about the Dauntless quite a bit in the Midway podcast and so on. So, next aircraft that is not War Thunder, I expect it to be in War Thunder someday, is the B-18 Bolo, which kind of has... I mean, it's not I wouldn't say this is one of the most important... I mean, it's a freaking footnote probably in U.S. aircraft history. This was a pre-war plane. It was based on the commercial airliner, the Douglas DC-2, correct, I believe? Yes?
It's half DC-2, half DC-3, yeah.
Okay. And nickname Bolo, you know where that came from?
No, that was the name that it was just given.
Right,
I have
but
no idea
the
where
air
it came
crews
from.
came up with it. Well, this is what I was reading a book. Air crews came up with a joke that be on the lookout for because it was never used. And so, anyway, it's just a joke that
Makes sense.
they had. When it entered the war, it was already obsolete. And do you have any combat history of this aircraft? I think it's an ugly looking plane, but...
Well, it is. It's kind of a bastard airplane. What it is, it's basically the DC-2 fuselage with a new nose, DC-3 wings, and a DC-3 tail. Is basically what it is. It was designed as a stopgap bomber. Boeing had problems with the B-17, and the Army needed more airplanes, so they went to Douglas, and Douglas very, very, very quickly designed this thing. What they're famous for in the war is anti-submarine patrol in the Caribbean and in the Atlantic, also search and rescue. They flew hours and hours and hours on end in anti-submarine patrol, especially down in the Caribbean. That's where most of them were. That's really it.
I've seen one in real life, and it was...
Yeah, there's only a couple left. There's one here in California.
It's not a very good looking plane. You just kind of look at
I
it.
kind of like it. It was, and actually, some of them had search radar put on it, which is it's really, really, really funky looking. And it was the very first airplane to ever carry a MAD boom, a magnetic anomaly detector boom. You can detect submarines underwater. It's basically a big giant magnet detector that sticks off the back end of the
Courtesy of the
airplane.
British.
Yeah, it was the very first U.S. airplane to have that.
And that's all I'm going to talk about the B-18. I expect to see it in game, hopefully sooner than later. I think it would be a nice addition in the early bomber.
It would be
tech
a nice
tree.
addition. I agree.
The plane that we see in game, that's been in game since day one, is the A-20, and then we have the DB-7, we have the British Havoc, and so on. I guess, do you want to talk about the history of the A-20, or shall I, or...
And I'm Ed Heineman, I can tell you that
there
much.
You go. Why don't you go with that? The prototype, the A-20 has kind of a storied history. I'll let Cobey go ahead and start it with the creators.
The A-20 was designed by Ed Heineman and Jack Northrop. It was Jack Northrop's last design that he worked on at Douglas. It was designed for the Air Force. It was a private project from Douglas to try to get a contract. Remember, this is during the Great Depression where airplane companies had to scramble. The Army originally showed a little bit of interest and then backed off. In the meantime, the French, desperately looking for airplanes, signed a contract for 100 and something airplanes off the bat called the DB-7. There were several delivered until France fell to the Nazis in 1940. The rest were all delivered to the French.
The British.
Or sorry, to the British. Thank you. And actually, the Havoc Mark 1 that's in the game, in the British tree is a DB-7 set up for night fighting.
Right, the British just took them and then refitted them with their weapons and...
Yep, they took off those 8mm Lebel machine guns and the French radios, put British radios and 303s on the airplane. That's basically all they did. The throttles were still backwards. The French for a long time had this stupid thing where in normal airplanes when you throttle when you add throttle you push the throttle forward, but the French designed it just the opposite, where when you add throttle you pull it back. So they were set up for reverse throttles. And all the DB-7s were delivered that way.
Step back a bit. Let's talk about the A-20 program from the beginning. For its date, was a very ambitious program to have a bomber that flew that fast with tricycle landing gear and this feature. The A-20...
Supercharged engines, which normally change and naturally aspirated engines. They had problems with the superchargers.
So the thing about the A-20, like you say, I've always felt it's kind of a little too low tiered in some ways in War Thunder, but date wise, this thing was a very early advanced aircraft. And the French used it first, the British used it, and then I think we eventually ordered it for the U.S. Army. And then you want to talk about the differences with the A-20s for the U.S. side?
Oh, the A-20 is a totally different airplane. It's a little bit bigger. The DB-7 originally was designed to where crew members couldn't move from their stations, so if you were the gunner in the back, you were stuck in the back. With the A-20, they redesigned the wing a little bit and the fuselage to where you can get to other portions of the airplane. In fact, actually, it was such a big problem that the early French airplanes actually had controls for the gunner in the back to take over the airplane in case something happened to the pilot. But they got rid of that. The A-20 also had, like I said, natural aspirated engines, no superchargers, no turbochargers. And they eventually got a turret from Martin that was put on the back. It's a standard 50 caliber twin 50 turret that was later on the B-24.
It's a powered turret.
And a bunch of other airplanes. Yeah, hydraulically powered turret. Same turret that's on the B-25 as well.
And then there was the A-20. Enough cannot be said about how many roles. This thing saw service on every continent. It filled a crap ton of roles for each army. Well, the U.S. used it every possible way. The British used it. The Russians used it. The French used it. It saw service in the Pacific. It saw service in Europe, and so on. Blah blah blah. You real quickly want to talk about all the different roles it filled before we move on?
Bomber, attacker, night fighter, reconnaissance, long range patrol. You name it, it did it.
And it saw service all the way to the very end.
Yep.
If you have any questions about these aircraft, feel free to ask. We're going to kind of stop. The A-20s, we could do a whole podcast on it, but I just want to do kind of a quick encapsulation. It's been in the game forever. All of us are very familiar with it in one way or another from the tech trees that is in. Next plane we're going to talk about, which will never be in War Thunder, but I felt I would feel horrible if we did a Douglas podcast and we never mentioned the C-47. That'd be just, that'd be tragic. The C-47 is the military version of the DC-3, which is, DC-3s are still flying today in the world.
They haven't been made since 1945, yet they're still flying.
Eisenhower said there's 4 important weapons: the bazooka, the Jeep, the atomic bomb, and the C-47.
C-47 was a standard U.S. Army transport airplane during the war. It basically did everything. From drop paratroopers to dropping jeeps and delivering supplies, taking home medevac people, taking home dead people, you name it, it did it. It did everything, absolutely everything during the war. After the war, they used it for search and rescue as radio relay airplanes, and in Vietnam, they used it as the AC-47, which was a gunship that had side-mounted Gatling guns on the left side, and it would
essentially the original
kill everything in
AC-130,
sight.
like
that's
the
exactly
father
it.
of the AC-130 program.
Yep. It's also used for electronic warfare and a bunch of other stuff too. It's a great airplane.
The main thing you're always going to remember it from, at least from a Hollywood standpoint, as the plane, and it's a very important piece of its history, as the plane that the U.S. airborne troops used to launch into Sicily and into D-Day. And there was over 1,000 C-47s used for the invasion of D-Day. And that must have just been an absolute crazy sight to see that many aircraft taking off. And you watch the beginning of Band of Brothers, they're all, I believe they had, 3 real ones flying for that, and then they just kind of use trickery to fill up the sky. There's not, it's hard to get that many of them before painting together, but it carried everything. It dropped troops, without it, so on. It wasn't anything, I don't know how to say this. It wasn't anything really special, though. It was just reliable, and we built a crap ton of them.
Yep. Still to this day we use them. The Forest Service still uses 2 of them to drop smoke jumpers with, to this day.
Unfortunately, though, it's never going to see War Thunder because it just has 0 place in it,
Yeah, well, it's a cargo airplane. You can't really
do
anything with it.
But I just felt it had to be mentioned because it was the backbone of the U.S. Army Air. Now we're going to talk about the A-26, which, real quickly, let's mention this. Cobey and I have been playing since late 1.27, basically early 1.29 in War Thunder patch terms. There has been basically next to 0 window for us to get the A-26. I think it's fair to say
there's been 0 windows for Americans to get.
I think there was one Indian Summer Challenge, but it was such a ridiculous amount of kills. I think it was in there as a chance. If this is at least a year ago.
It was the top. It was the top prize. I remember that.
I just looked at it and vomited in a trash can and moved on. I didn't even attempt to try it. But I'm just gonna say, if anybody from Guys never listens to this, if you put an A-26 in for 6,000, 7,000, 8,000, 10,000 Golden Eagles, it would probably sell.
Yeah, I'd buy one. Yeah, I'd like to have a premium A-26. That would be nice.
Just
More importantly, I'd like to have the A-26B, not the A-26C that's in the game right now. The B had 14 machine guns facing forward on it, 8 in the nose, 6 in the wings.
So go ahead and take it away with the A-26.
Well, the A-26 was designed to basically off the back of what happened with the Mosquito, which was a very fast daylight bomber and used speed as its main defensive armament. However, the A-26 had remote control turrets. In fact, actually, the B-29 has the same fire control system and the same turrets that are on the A-26. They were on the A-26 originally. The first airplanes were built with a 75mm cannon in the nose, which, just like on the B-25, was an absolutely terrible idea, and that quickly went away. It was fast. It was as fast as a P-51 in level flight. Very, very, very fast airplane. It could carry, I think it was 4,000 pounds of bombs, quite a lot of bombs. It's just a great airplane. It's one of the most underrated airplanes ever built, in my opinion. There are various records in the later part of the European Air War where they would come in, they'd drop their bombs, and then they'd fight their way out and shoot down 2 or 3 airplanes on the way out back to England. In Korea, it was used as a interdiction airplane to attack bridges and roads and all sorts of good stuff like that. The Air Force used them at night as well. In fact, that's why in the game you'll see them painted black, because the Air Force mostly used them at night. The one that's in the game is the A-26C, which has a glass nose for a bombardier, and they use those a lot of times in Korea. They were modified and flew in Vietnam as the A-26K or the B-26K, depending on who you speak to. Same thing, interdiction. They were specifically used to hunt down the Ho Chi Minh Trail infrastructure. Carry a crap ton of stuff on it.
I had no idea their service went into that far.
Yeah, oh yeah, it was a great airplane. An absolutely fantastic airplane. The Canadians used them as fire bombers up until the early 2000s. That's it.
The weather service used them as well through, I know, the 60s and 70s.
Oh yeah. Yep, absolutely.
And then I know a bunch of them wound up, after they were surplused out, in the hands of drug lords running certain illegal products into the States.
Yeah, after Korea, the A-26, due to its speed, became a very, very, very popular executive airplane. And actually, the kind of nail in the coffin for the A-26 was the Learjet. Before the Learjet came out, it was the fastest available executive airplane you could buy. A lot of them were converted into executive transports, and then once the Learjets came out and once other business jets came out, they went to the secondary market. And because of its speed and because of its payload, it was extremely popular with the drug runners.
And there's one that is, I believe, flying with the Commemorative Air Force, and that plane was one that the DEA captured, and then it was restored back into some form of A-26.
Yeah, there's several airplanes flying now. There's a bunch of them here in California. The company that had them up as fire bombers in Canada has slowly been selling them off, not to deplete the market, not to drive prices down, so that they let one or two go every couple of years. They're slowly getting restored back to their original wartime configuration for the most part.
So just a plane that I think, as I said, as Cobey and I, a couple American aircraft fanboys, we would like to see the A-26 have a bigger presence in War Thunder.
Awesome.
Even though
I'd love to have it in the game.
Even though it's kind of a mess, you don't see it very often. I don't know. The A-26C is, I don't think, by any means running away with the kills and the RP in the game. I would just like it to have a bigger presence.
Yep.
Now we're gonna move on to
bring in the B model too.
We're going to move on to the BTD Destroyer, which I probably would have never mentioned, but since it is a premium aircraft in the game, there's not a whole lot to know about it. It was meant to replace both the Dauntless and the Avenger, correct?
And the Helldiver.
We had the Helldiver came in there. Anyway, Helldiver had such a... Anyway, Helldiver, that's another topic.
Yeah.
It came in basically at the very, very end of the war. I think, a handful, 20-something odd were made. Never hit, I believe, service. It was just...
it was in service. It never hit combat.
Never hit combat. Thank you. And then I don't know what else. I look at the aircraft and there's some kind of weird things to it that I just don't quite understand.
It's ugly.
There's two questions. Yeah, there's two questions that people always ask me. So I'll ask you. Maybe you know this. Why does it have a squared nose?
For engine cooling and more aerodynamic, whatever.
Okay. And the other thing to notice is it has its weird tail that's kicked off to the side to help with trim.
Counteract torque. Yeah. When you in American airplanes and British airplanes, most airplanes except Russian and French airplanes, for some reason they always do it shit backwards because they're weird. When you apply power on a propeller-powered airplane, you need to give to counteract the torque. You need to continually give the airplane some right rudder. We've gotten away from that with rudder trim. You can basically trim it out. But what Ed Heinemann did, who designed it, was freaking genius. Basically, he canted the tail to the left so that you could keep your feet flat on the floor the whole time and never have to trim the rudder, never have to apply right rudder while at high power settings.
Why didn't more aircraft do that?
So the airplane will fly straight and true. Why what?
Why didn't more people do that?
I have no idea. It's just something that hasn't been done. Because it looks funny.
Okay. The other thing that note is, the thing I don't understand about the armament, I'm surprised they went with two 20mm cannons. I think that was something that if it stayed in service, it was probably going to be changed to at least 4 to 650 cals at some point.
It probably would have gotten another 2 cannons, I bet.
Or something. I don't see two 20mm as being a great offense, especially the way those things jammed. Our story, the U.S. history of 20mm wasn't very good, so I don't see that being a reliable...
The airplane wasn't a fighter. The airplane was designed to drop torpedoes and dive bomb. What the cannons were there for were to kill submarines, basically. At the time, the Germans had this thing called the snorkel, where they could basically stick a pipe up above the water and continue doing whatever they were doing down below for hours and hours and hours on end. They could recharge the batteries and run the engines, everything, just with that snorkel. And what the cannons were for was to defeat that, to destroy that stuff,
okay,
and to destroy landing craft and stuff like that. It wasn't by any means a fighter at all.
I know, but I think it's wishful thinking to hope that those two 20 millimeter cannons were gonna do what they thought they were gonna do with the reliability and so on. Works in game because it doesn't jam like the work with the 20 millimeter US cannons have many issues. One of them being light primer strikes. The hammer just didn't hit hard enough to set off the round. So basically, every X amount of rounds, you'd have a dead round inside your gun that didn't go off, and the cannon was dead weight.
Yeah, and the reason why is because we weren't very good at it, and really, we weren't very good at it until we basically stole the German designs after the war. All the successful U.S. aircraft cannons post-war were all based on German designs. Every single one of them.
The Spano to save our life.
Yep.
So anyway, that's long story short. That's why I don't like the BTDs. In-game 20 millimeter, great. In real life, I don't see that thing playing out like they thought. And then let's talk about how the BTD and let's do a condensed Skyraider topic right now, and then we'll do a whole Skyraider podcast whenever it gets into game to give it the full glory and love that it needs. So you want to talk about the BTD Destroyer led to the Skyraider program?
Yeah, the Destroyer was canceled by the Navy. Ed Heinemann and his assistant were in Washington, D.C. for meetings with the Navy as far as orders. The Navy indicated that they were going to order the airplane in significant numbers. So Ed Heinemann and his assistants flew to Washington, D.C. to do some contract negotiations. The Navy then sprung on them that they were going to cancel the project due to the end of the war. They were not very happy about it. Ed Heinemann asked for some money that was left over in the project to design a whole new airplane. The Navy said yes. They went back to Ed Heinemann's hotel room in Washington, D.C. and overnight designed the A-1 Skyraider.
With pen and paper.
It is, yeah, that's
no
exactly
computers,
it.
No CAD, no
nothing, none of that stuff. Slide rules, and that's it. The Skyraider, in my opinion, is probably one of the best airplanes ever made. Period. Certainly one of the best combat airplanes ever made, if not the best. It served all the way up through Vietnam, up until the end with the South Vietnamese Air Force. The French flew them, the British flew them, the Swedish flew them. It's a great airplane. And that's all I'm going to say about it for now.
The last plane, which I've heard rumors, I've seen some devs post about it, a couple people have mentioned it to me, is the Skyknight. And I think Cobey and I are going to have different points of view on this. The reason I wouldn't bring up the Skyknight, any other reason besides the stuff I see in the forums, and I have no idea when this will ever happen, if it will ever happen, but they say it might or it will. The Skyknight may be coming in in the U.S. tech trees someday. No date I know of. And at first, my general opinion and my reaction to it is why. I know it did serve in Korea. If you look up the Skyknight, you're going to see it was one of the airplanes that was used with air-to-air missiles. It won't be that variant put into War Thunder. Everybody calm down. Air-to-air missiles are not coming to War Thunder. It'll be an earlier variant that had, I think, 420 millimeters that fired tiny TIMs and carried a couple 1,000-pound or 2,000-pound bombs on it. Basically, the fighter bomber variant is what I expect to come into War Thunder. It would be probably the F3D -2.
Yeah.
And you want to quickly talk about the Skyknight? I'm kind of like I don't know. I don't really care. Probably I'd say, but it's not a plane that I'm pounding my fist and says this must be put in War Thunder.
Well, it's a pretty good airplane. It served us very well in Korea and actually later in Vietnam for a little bit. The Skyknight was the Navy's very first off-the-paper designed night fighter. The Air Force at the time was developing the F-89 Scorpion, and the Navy became very, very, very jealous, so they developed the Skyknight. Ed Heinemann designed it. It's woefully underpowered until the -2 came out. It served pretty well in Korea. It shot down several MiGs, shot down a PO2, which everyone raves, talks about, and actually, evidence points to maybe a second PO2 the same night by the same crew. The PO2 that they shot down was kind of a big deal because they shot down a PO2, but it was also the very first time that a U.S. airplane tracked and killed an airplane only by radar. And that's it. The pilots never saw the airplane. They They never did anything like that. It was all radar. You know, the radar locked onto it. They were guided to the target by the radar. They shot when the radar told them to shoot down, and that's it. It served in Korea very well. It escorted B-29s over North Korea. They shot down several MiGs, several Yak-15s and 17s because of it. The PO2, of course. And later on, it served as a trainer. And then in the early part of Vietnam, the Marines had one squadron of them that were modified for electronic warfare. They served for a couple of years.
Now, let's talk about what its impact in War Thunder is going to be. I don't think it's going to be doing the things it did in real life in the game by any means. I don't think it's going to match up well against MiG-15 Bisses or CL-13s.
No, not at all. Not at all.
I think it might be a nice addition, a shiny addition to the US Tech tree, but I don't think it's going to be a huge difference maker. It might be a better plane for like ground forces at that tier as a fighter bomber. I cannot see this thing and buy into it being a good fighter, a good cannon on cannon, MiG-15 versus Skyknight fighter. I just can't buy that. But that's just me personally. That's my own opinion, whatever that's worth.
Well, yeah, that's very true. And you have to remember that the airplane was a night fighter. The airplane wasn't designed to go toe to toe with a MiG-15. Night fighters at the time were designed to track onto a target, intercept the target, and shoot it down. There is no air combat maneuvering. There's none of that shit like you see in the game where you juke and move and evade and everything else like that. And it didn't happen at night because you can't see.
Right. Is there anything else you want to say about Douglas or about the developers or anything we want to close this out with?
Ed Heidemann was a fucking genius. Anyone who says so can bite my shiny metal ass. Douglas was a great company. They were one of the few companies that sold both to the Navy and the Army at the time when contracts were very, very, very hard to get. He did it right. It's a great airplane, great company. I absolutely love Douglas airplanes. They're my favorite.
Just look up the amount of aircraft that Douglas built. It's if you go on Wiki and just type like Douglas aircraft list or something, it's massive.
It's insane.
And so from that, I wanted to spend a little bit of time talking about that, and I'm probably going to try and do a Lockheed podcast probably in the future, and then we'll probably start moving back into the international, talk about German and British and so on. As it comes out, if a Fleet Air Arm patch actually happens before long, hopefully it happens 1.49, we'll try to do a podcast about that, try to get off of the American topic. But like I said, we did Republic last week. I wanted to do Douglas right now because I just felt like these are two companies that deserved to be mentioned. So thanks for listening, and we will catch you next time.
You know what airplanes are coming out in 1.49?
I have no idea. I've not seen much. I just know that at least the rumors I saw was Fleet Air Arm coming out 1.47. That didn't happen. Yeah. So I hope that it's coming out 1.49, especially the way British got basically nothing in this last patch. And British ground forces isn't probably going to come out that soon. So I'm hoping that the majority of aircraft come out are finally things like the Sea Fury and the all that crap we've been waiting for forever. So
yeah, I'd like to have not the Ferry Battle. What's the other one? Ferry Firefly. That'd be nice.
Yeah, a lot of iconic British planes are still missing, but hopefully it happens. Anyway, take care. We'll catch you next time.
Bye.